Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MAA-SIAM-AMS Hrabowski-Gates-Tapia-McBay session. The session this morning, or this afternoon, or whenever, the session consists of a lecture from our honoree and lecturer, Dave Kung, followed by a short panel discussion. The MAA-SIAM-AMS Hrabowski-Gates-Tapia-McBay lecture is named after four influential scientists of color. Freeman Hrabowski, the president of the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, Jim Gates at Brown University and formerly of University of Maryland College Park, Richard Tapia, Rice University, and the late Shirley McBay, who passed away recently in November 2021. And Dr. McBay was a founder and former president of Quality Education for Minorities. The MAA-SIAM-AMS Hrabowski-Gates-Tapia-McBay lecture is presented annually to an individual who helps to systematically recruit, welcome, encourage, mentor, and support individuals from underrepresented groups in the US. This year, the honor goes to Dr. Dave Kung. Dave Kung serves as the Director of Policy at the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin. In this role, Dave enacts the center's mission of ensuring that all students, particularly those from groups historically underserved, have equitable access to an excellent modern math and science education. Specifically, Dave leads the Dana Center's policy team and supports collaborations with state agencies and professional associations of mathematicians to ensure that the next generation of STEM professionals reflect the full diversity of our society. Now, before the Dana Center made the fantastic decision to invite Dave to join their team, I had the pleasure of working with Dave in his role as our first Director of Strategy and Implementation at TIPSI Math, Transforming Post-Secondary Education in Mathematics. In that role, Dave helped to move TIPSI towards the vision that post-secondary education in mathematics will enable all students, regardless of their identity, background, or chosen program of study, want to help them develop the modern mathematical knowledge and skills that they need for productive engagement in society and in the workplace. You're seeing a theme here, I'm sure. And aside from these that I've already talked about, Dave serves the higher education mathematics community in several roles. And we probably all know Dave for directing the amazing MAA Project Next, New Experiences in Teaching program, and which is, I would say, the math community's premier professional development program for early career professors. I'm the executive director of SIAM, and I will say that SIAM is happy to be able to sponsor two Project Nexters, and we started doing that a couple of years ago, and Project Next is actually absolutely wonderful. Dave also works closely with other organizations, but I don't want to talk too much longer. We want to hear Dave. But I want to mention, though, that Dave Kung has engaged audience around the world with two of the great courses, lecture series on math and music. He's an amazing violinist, and with mind-bending paradoxes. He has authored a variety of articles and books on topics in harmonic analysis and mathematics education as well. Lastly, I'll mention that Dave Kung was recently awarded the Deborah and Franklin Tepper Hymo Award, the MAA's highest award in college mathematics teaching, for his work at St. Mary's College of Maryland. And St. Mary's is a public honors college outside Washington, DC, where Dave resides, playing violin and running, never at the same time, but sometimes and often alongside his beloved daughter. Now, let's hear from Dr. Dave Kung on his talk entitled, Why the Math Community Struggles with Equity and Diversity and Why There's Reason for Hope.
Susie, thank you so much for the generous introduction, and I'm really honored to be giving the Hrabowski-Gates-Tapia-McBay lecture. You know, on my calendar, it was just HGTM, and Ellie looked over my shoulder one day. She was super excited to see this on my calendar. Turns out she misread it. She thought I was going to be on HGTV, but you know, it's the M there that's important. And I think Shirley McBay, I think she's probably the least well-known of the four in the mathematics community. You know, in your introduction, you gave some of the details of her life. But she had degrees in both chemistry and mathematics, along with a PhD in mathematics. And she worked at Spelman, at NSF, and at MIT before founding what you mentioned, the Quality Education for Minorities Project. In part because she passed away last fall, I'm really honored to give this talk in her name. So with that, I'm going to talk today about diversity in the mathematics community, and I want to frame this in something that Edre Goins mentioned in his MAA Project Next lecture yesterday. That after many decades of working on DEI issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've only made marginal progress. And why is that? Well, part of the answer to that is just pure, it's just racism, sexism, things like that, overt and implicit. And if you want to learn more about that, you should go on YouTube and find last year's talk. I think I should probably introduce it like previously on HGTM. No, it's Erica Graham did fantastic work with this, and you should go watch it. And then you should come back here. So I just want to convince you that we actually do struggle with with DEI issues. Excuse me. But in particular today, I want to talk about the many issues that are very math specific. And I'll say up front, the slides to this talk are public, and I think Carrie's going to share a link to them. I want to start by just convincing you that we in math do actually really struggle with EDI, DEI, however you want to say it, with inclusion issues. And so we're going to look at some National Science Foundation data. Now, I want to be clear, we know that gender isn't binary, but all these NSF data act as if gender were binary. We know that there are problems with racial classifications. That we're using, NSF data use the US government's 5 racial classifications. From my perspective, it puts all Asian Americans in one group. That's an awfully large group with a whole lot of diversity, but it's what we have. And so let's look at some NSF data. Let's look at women in STEM. So there's undergraduate degrees given to women and by discipline. So here you can see the percentage of all undergraduate degrees given to women. And you can see over here, it's been over 50% since way back in the 80s. This starts in 1988 and goes through 2018. But there's more women than men getting undergraduate degrees. Now we can break this out and look at the various STEM disciplines. Here's biology and chemistry. Biology is the only field in STEM where women are overrepresented. Here's computer science, physics, and engineering, all down around 20% for women. And here's mathematics. Now, most people, when they see this in the math community, they think it's a little higher than they might otherwise predict. The NSF data don't disaggregate between people looking at future teaching careers and those looking at going to graduate school or industry or something like that. And the future teachers are much skewed toward women. And so it would be lower if you looked at, for instance, the pipeline toward graduate school. Let's look at minorities. And again, the language isn't my favorite. In NSF speak, they call them underrepresented minorities. I prefer to call them minoritized folks or racially minoritized people. And you can see we've made lots of progress with these groups. And for the NSF, this includes African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans. But it's 10% back here in the late 80s, and we're up to 24% of all degrees. Chemistry and biology are pretty close to that. Physics, computer sciences, and engineering. Computer sciences, an interesting history there. It's a long history of great African-American success in computer science. And here's mathematics. If you look over here, we're getting about 13% of math degrees at the undergraduate level are going to people from these groups. Just to give you a sense, my goal in this isn't like equal representation. Like if there's 13.6% Hispanics in this country, I'm not looking for 13.6% of math majors to be Hispanic, but we're really far from representation. If you look at these populations in the 2018 what we have from the 2018 census, 31.7% of Americans come from those groups. And if you restrict yourself to college-age students, 20 to 24, it goes up to 37.2. It's barely even on the screen. So we are really far from equal representation, and this is this is just a symptom of all of the systemic issues that we have within the mathematics culture. Here's a quick overview of where we're headed today before we get to the panel part of today's session. I'm going to talk about real math-specific reasons that we have, both why we struggle and why there's reason for hope. And just as an example of a mathematical reason for hope, mathematicians understand logic. So, for instance, I am not making claims about all Black people or all mathematicians or all women or anything like that. And so we know that if somebody says, "Well, not all Black mathematicians are not," like, that's not a counterexample to the argument that I'm making, because I'm not making an argument about all of any group. So that's an example of the math-specific thinking that we can do. So let's jump in here. The reasons why we struggle with equity, diversity, and inclusion. I want to do a little thought experiment. Like, when I'm going to flash up some accomplishments that somebody might be have made, and I want you to think for a second. What adjectives come to mind about a person who's done these? They scored 800 on the SAT, or they scored 38 points on the Putnam, or they aced calculus really early, or they were on the Olympiad team, or maybe they passed an analysis qual on the first day of graduate school. So I think we have a chat open. Go ahead and in chat, like, type out an adjective that you said that comes to mind as you hear about these descriptors of somebody. And go ahead and hit return whenever. And let's look. So if we did this, if we did this for people out there, like, let's think about this for a second. Like, here's an example of the adjectives that I think you would get if you did this with a general audience, right? Of course, a general audience that, like, knew what the Putnam exam was, right? And it's so many of these, like, brilliant, hardworking, bright, smart, intelligent. What I want to focus on here is that so many of these are about innate talent, right? They're about some sort of innate view of how people succeed and what it takes to succeed in mathematics. And that comes across in in our culture in many ways. So here's how math gets portrayed in culture. Here's Ramanujan, as played by Dev Patel. Here's Good Will Hunting. Here's Charlie Epps from Numbers. Here's Russell Crowe playing John Nash. In all these cases, these were characters or people who were seen as just brilliant, right? As having some sort of innate talent. And it's not a coincidence that they're all male. And it's not a coincidence that they're all white and Asian. It's part of what we think as a culture is about mathematical success, that it's about brilliance, and that only certain people are more likely to possess it. So I'm going to move through some of the things I've done. Susie mentioned some of these things. These are accomplishments or milestones, things that but I'm going to go through them in reverse order for a particular reason, right? So, the note about passing the analysis qual, that was me. I passed the analysis qual on day one. Of course, the previous year, as a senior in college, I had taken graduate analysis. And going all the way back to very early, it turns out both of my parents were college math teachers. My dad was a professor, my mom was a lecturer in the local college, and at home we had games and toys everywhere, right? And I want to focus just on one of these accomplishments, on the fact that on day one of graduate school, I passed the analysis qual. And I want to really highlight, here's how our ideas of innate brilliance and talent and natural ability come in. You see, my classmates didn't know all of my background before that, all the opportunities I had had, right? What they knew is that on the first day of graduate school, this one guy, Dave, right, he didn't show up to orientation because he was off taking the analysis qual, and he passed it. And this is why brilliance here, this idea of brilliance and us pegging things as innate talent, has a serious EDI component as a problem. See, at this stage, there were others in graduate school, at my graduate school, at other graduate schools, who had just as much potential as I did. But they didn't have the previous opportunities I had. My previous opportunities were invisible, and so I got labeled with a whole bunch of adjectives. Those others, people who didn't have those many opportunities, they were more likely to be women, more likely to be Black, Latinx, Indigenous. They were more likely to be experiencing poverty. They were more likely to be the first in their families to go to college. They didn't get labeled as brilliant or smart. There's a real logical flaw in our reasoning here, right? And so there's this assumption that you start with brilliance. A kid is just brilliant, and then they get lots of opportunities, and that's what leads to success. But the reality, at least for the vast majority of people who make it in mathematics, is that the opportunities come first. And then they get labeled as, quote, brilliant, and that's what leads to success. Now, again, I'm not saying that every mathematician is like that. I think Ramanujan is maybe the most famous example where sort of brilliance cut through with fewer opportunities than many. But for the vast majority of people, even the ones who make it, it starts with opportunities, and that's what gets somebody labeled as smart or talented or something like that. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that it doesn't take work. It takes hard work no matter what, right? You have to work hard to succeed in mathematics, just like you have to work hard and succeed in almost anything. That hard work is sometimes hidden, but it's the focus here that I think we need to pay greater attention to the opportunities, and we need to take a less of a focus on the brilliance, the sort of innate qualities. Stephen Jay Gould was thinking about how we have this obsession with Einstein's brain. There's even a book about Einstein's brain, right? Here's what he had to say about Einstein's brain. I'm less interested in it than the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops, right? Let's talk more about opportunities and less about sort of this innate view of what it takes to succeed. Now, this language we use about success, about what it takes to succeed, it's internalized by everyone. In my case, my professors, my teachers, my classmates, me, like we all internalize this language, and there's real problems with this language. But that language is reinforced by patterns of success, which go, by race, by gender, by lots of other identity tags. And that language about minoritized student success, you can see it here too. She was a real star. He was a diamond in the rough. There's real problems with this language. Think about stars and diamonds, sort of fixed, pre-made, sort of innate. They're just there. So many well-meaning mathematicians talk about saying things like the diamond in the rough without thinking about what they mean by the rough, or how like they're to be seen in this metaphor, I guess, as like carefully shaping this diamond that pre-exists, right? There are real problems with this idea of talent, of being successful in mathematics as coming from innate qualities. Here's how some of the data we have that suggests that that this idea of brilliance is really a problem when it comes to EDI issues. So what we're going to graph here is innate talent. We're going to graph different disciplines. Innate talent more important, and this is by perception. So you can ask people, is innate talent important to succeed in math? Is it important to succeed in biology, other fields? And on the vertical axis, we're going to look at the percentage of women. So if a dot up here, if a field appeared up here, it would be requiring lots of, seen as requiring lots of talent and having lots of women in it. And so when we populate this with lots of fields, here's what we get. And here's mathematics over here. It's kind of interesting. There's only one field on here where talent is seen as required, even more so, music theory and composition. But in general, you look at this and you're like, oh, you know what? If talent is seen as more important, there are fewer women in the field. This is research from just a couple of years ago, right? So this is evidence that this idea of brilliance, which we hold very very close to in mathematics, is really important in equity and diversity issues. And now this is data about gender, but I think the same would probably hold true if we went to race. Here's something about implicit association tests. And so what they're testing is how closely in your mind are two concepts connected. So if you took this test and this is about male and genius versus female and creative. If you are much quicker to associate male with genius and female with creative, then your dot would be up here. If you were much, much quicker to do that, then it would be way up here. On the other hand, if you were quicker to do the reverse, quicker to associate female with genius and male with creative, then your dot would be down here. Right? And so when you give this to lots of people, here's what you get. Here's what you give it when you give it to men. And you can see that men tend to think that in their brains, like male is much more closely connected to genius than it is than the other way around. And when you give this test to women, here we go. This is what you see, right? And so men and women both tend to think of genius as being associated with men more than women. And again, if we did this, I don't think the study's been done in terms of race, but I think that's probably, you would see similar patterns. You might say, okay, these are given to adult men and women, right? And so, once adults have been in the workplace, in our institutions, they've seen these patterns, right? And so they've seen who's in the mathematics community. But actually, they did the study and they went back and they looked at kids. And so these are from 9 and 10-year-olds. So even when you look at 9 and 10-year-olds, they've already have these patterns about who's seen as genius and who's more seen as creative. And again, there's an assumption of gender binary here that we now reject. But in general, men, women, boys, and girls all associate math with male with genius and female with creative. Here's more about this myth of brilliance. It impacts opportunities. It constrains our imagined success, both ours and the people around us. It impacts our success. It reinforces existing inequalities. And that's what I want to say about the myth of brilliance. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But let's move on to talk about purity and working from first principles. If you do a Google search on purity in math, this is what you come up with. It's a fairly famous XKCD comic. And the psychologists are looking over at the sociologists, and the biologists look over at them, and the chemists look over, and there's physics. Oh, biology is just applied physics. It's nice to be on top. And then way over here in terms of purity, I'm like, hey guys, I didn't see you all the way over there. There's mathematicians, right? And so this idea of purity of our community, of our discipline being pure, it's deeply ingrained, and it's even so much that we joke about it. I think there's many ways to frame this, sort of that we build mathematics up from first principles, or that it's axiomatic, that it's theoretical, that it's sort of separated from physical reality. This word here, pure, this bothers me. There's a particular moment every year when it wigs me out. It's when the Westminster Dog Show comes on, and it's always in the news. Like, it just weirds me out to talk about these purebred dogs. Like, to me, it just feels like we're just one step away from eugenics, from talking about some sort of pure Aryan race. Like, that's purity in that sense, right? And these terms here, these are different, and I'll leave it to others to sort of unpack the differences. I'm kind of lumping them all together today. Now, I want to be clear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the sort of theoretical nature of mathematics is bad. What I am saying is that when we value purity, it inhibits our progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. That's what I'm trying to say. So let's unpack this purity problem. Here's one problem with it. Like, when you talk about purity, it inherently sets up a dichotomy, in and out, right? It sets up this dichotomy both in terms of our work and in terms of people. Who is seen as belonging in the math world? That's an important question when it comes to DEI issues. Who sees themselves as belonging in the math world, right? How can we help each student, every single student that comes to us, see themselves as belonging? This is something we really need to work on, right? Now, Francis Su wrote beautifully about this. Who gets to order off the secret menu at the Chinese restaurant? Who's sort of in the in group? Like, we need to, and we need to do both things. We need to help students see themselves in math spaces, but we also need to make sure that math spaces change to be more welcoming of all. It's a two-way street. Here's another core problem with purity and sort of working from first principles. Math, much of it can be built up from first principles. This is true. Like, is some planar geometry statement true? You start with Euclid's axioms and you work up to it. Are there really infinitely many sizes of infinity? You start with the definition of cardinality and you work up to it. And yep, it's true. But when it comes to human experiences and interactions cannot be built up from first principles. What is it like to be a Black woman in mathematics? That's something I will never know. I can't just go back to some definitions and say, oh, I'm going to build this up. Oh, that's what it's like to be a Black woman in mathematics. And I'm not saying that every Black woman in mathematics has the same experiences, far from it. What I am saying is there's a commonality of experiences, and part of that commonality I will never know. There is no way for me to get a handle on that. I can have some empathy for it, but there's no way for me to really know what it's like to be a Black woman in mathematics. There's no way for me to know what it's like to be a trans person in my own department. This human experience, we cannot build this up from first principles. And I think we tend to think we can do anything from first principles. And it's just not true when it comes to these sorts of human interactions. And these lived experiences, they depend in part on how others view us and how we view ourselves. And those stories, those human interactions, we cannot just go back to the beginning and work from axioms. Empathy is hard. We need more of it, especially in mathematics, and it's especially hard, I think, for mathematicians. Here's a third core problem with purity and working from first principles. Not everyone has the privilege of choosing a subject and doing it just for the love of it, doing a subject that's really divorced from reality. If you go off, when you have conversations with first-gen students and families, like, so many of them want their kids to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers, right? There's a much greater emphasis on career, and that's by necessity, right? They have to see those careers, the paths for their kids, as leading somewhere important. Thinking back to Edre's comments on the lecture on teaching and learning, His comments from students were like, I'd like to make more money to help my family, to help my community. Maybe I'm going to go into computer science or econ because those fields are seen as more connected to reality, connected to the problems of the world. Now, we sometimes do better jobs of this. There's a whole movement of math for social justice and some related fields like the CS curriculum. When you start with problems to motivate students, you see that closes a lot of the gaps. I think Harvey Mudd has done really excellent work closing gaps in gender by starting with problems instead of just diving headlong into sort of theoretical computer science. We can do that as well, doing more modeling and motivating students as to why they should be understanding these. How can we better ground mathematics and the problems people see around them? This is something, if we did this better, it would help with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this idea of purity, it has real problems. How do we replace our love of purity with something that's more just and more equitable? That would really help. I want to move on and talk about hidden structures. So hidden structures that are all around us that we don't see as much, but we need to if we really want to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So back in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, there were a bunch of us who got together and we started brainstorming, like, what could we do to make the mathematics community more equitable? And we thought, department chairs, they have a key role in here. They have a really key role. What if we got department chairs together to talk about issues, especially of racial justice, especially around, anti-Blackness within our mathematics community? And so, we thought we might get a few chairs together. I think there were 5 of us on the first call. And we thought maybe we'll get, 10, 15, maybe if we're lucky, 20 chairs. We ended up with 130 math chairs from around the community, from community colleges all the way through research institutions who wanted to talk about racial justice. And those conversations were really fantastic. They were sometimes difficult, but they sort of uncovered a lot of things for a lot of people, including some personal things. But the story I want to tell you is about a particular conversation I had in my group. We were talking about the order in which students register. What's the order students register in your school? If it's like every school I've been at, the order is by the number of credits earned most to least. And this totally makes sense. The seniors register first, right? They're the ones, like, they need that one senior level math credit to graduate, right? And so they should have the first choice. They should get into that system first. And then the juniors, and then the sophomores, and then the first year students, right? And I had been part of systems for, 3 decades that used this sort of a method. It never occurred to me that there might be some issues about race hidden in this. But we started asking questions in our reading group. Does every policy we looked at, does it exacerbate or does it address equity problems? Right? Certainly, on the face of it, this is sort of a race neutral, a gender neutral policy. But is it really? Like, we know that there are unequal opportunities. This goes back to this question of brilliance. We know that there are unequal opportunities in the systems before college. And what is this policy doing about that? It's just exacerbating it, right? So if we thought about it for a second, we would guess, some students are less likely to come into our college with credit. And in fact, I asked the institutional research folks to pull the numbers. White students coming into St. Mary's College of Maryland, 37% of them entered with some credit. The percentage of Black students entering with credits, it was, we pulled the numbers, it was 7%, right? And so there's this difference coming in, right? They are sort of, Black students are not exclusively at the end of the line, but they're more likely to be at the end of the line, not only that semester, but every semester after that. And it means every semester after that, Black students are less likely to get the courses they want, less likely to get the courses they need, less likely to fulfill requirements. I don't think this is a huge part of the 4 or 6 year graduation gap that we have by race, but it's definitely a part. And it's an example of a policy which, on the face of it, seems like it's race neutral and just not at all problematic. But when you dive into the data, when you look at it with fresh eyes, when you start seeing these sorts of hidden structures, they have an impact. And that's what I want to talk about. So I want to talk about the developmental math sequences. Now, these developmental math sequences are all over the place, especially if you're at a community college or a 4-year school that has a really high acceptance rate. Students come in, and by whatever placement test, they get placed into a math class, and sometimes they need one remedial class before they get to the credit-bearing class that they're trying to pass, college algebra in many places. And sometimes they need 2, and sometimes they need 3. So I want to look at the case where students are, by whatever test, they're referred to 3 levels of remediation, right? And so in this study, there were 63,000 students who were referred to 3 levels of remediation. My question for you is, what percent went on to pass the required course? In this case, there's college algebra for most of them. Go ahead and type in the chat. Like, what percentage of these students do you think ended up passing this gatekeeper math class, possibly 3 or 4 semesters later? So David Moulton guesses 33%. Rebecca's at 20%. I assume these numbers are going to keep coming in. Here we go. It was actually 11%. And the actual way you get to 11% is really fascinating. So here we go. Like, when people are referred to this much remediation, a full quarter of them don't even try. Like, they don't even start that first required course. And then they go on, some of them actually take that third course. And in fact, some of them don't pass, but a lot of them do, right? The pass rates for any one of these classes are actually not that bad, but a huge portion just give up after that. These sorts of developmental math sequences, these are just they are graveyards for the dreams of Black and brown students everywhere, because these students are far more likely to be Black and brown. And the throughput at the end of this, not one of these courses has a horrible pass rate. They all do okay, but in the end, only 11% pass the gatekeeper math course. This is just a prime example of a system which is hidden to many of us, which is deeply flawed. It's just when you talk about dreams deferred, here are dreams deferred. Every one of these students like applied to a college, got in, and wanted some sort of degree, right? And this is the system that we as mathematicians have control over, and this is what that system did to us, did to those folks. Lots of hidden structures. Here are just some of them that I think impact equity, diversity, and inclusion. The registration order, developmental math sequences, admissions, right? There's a whole bunch of parts of admissions, advising and placement, anything that's on a first come, first serve basis. That benefits people who have the free time to jump in and do things quickly. Hiring procedures, we talked about that at the AMS chairs meeting. Any policy that's opt-out versus opt-in, especially for something like an honors program, when a policy is opt-out, then people are more likely to come, especially minoritized students. When it's opt-in, minoritized students are more likely to just say, I don't think that's for me, right? Any sort of traditional assessments, dual credit, the AP credit policies, transfer and applicability. I would guess the vast majority of people who are at JMM, who are on this call right now, went to a single 4-year institution, right, and then went on to graduate school. If you're that far in your career, that's not the case for the vast majority of college students in this country. In fact, if you look at all college students taking calculus, over half of them are taking it at community colleges, and they all have to face transfer and applicability policies, which are not smooth. And those policies really have an impact and a disproportionate impact on minoritized students. Even schedules, for faculty, late afternoon courses, hard for parents, and we know that caregiving, falls more likely on women and mothers. The accessibility of spaces, that's something that's hugely hidden for most of us. The use of standardized tests, like all of these are hidden structures that we have. And I want to point out one thing that's really important about this. These are hidden, these are hard to see, but they're particularly hard for me to see if they benefited me, right? I was the beneficiary of lots of these policies, right? And therefore it's hard for me to see these. And that may be true of you as well. We need to do better at looking at policies and procedures, looking at these hidden structures that didn't impact us, but do impact others and disproportionately impact women, impact Black students, Latinx students, first-gen students. And it's not just academic structures, right? It's an embarrassing moment from earlier in my life. I was hanging out in college and we were watching some traffic go by, and we noticed that there were these Black men driving really fancy cars, and we were sitting there talking, and that just seemed like a really dubious financial choice, right? Like, why'd they spend their money on that? And put aside this obvious sort of coded racism, it feels a little bit like when Kamala Harris was recently castigated for buying a $600 Le Creuset pot, as if she doesn't have $600 in her budget to pay for that. But what we were really saying when we were sitting there, was that like, why are they drawing these? But underlying, why are they driving these cars? Underlying that thought is that there are structures that I know that I'm used to, and that given those structures, that's not a choice I would have made. I would have put that money into housing or something else. But there were hidden structures that I wasn't seeing. What's the value of a car in a community where public transit is dehumanizing? And the value of that car gets passed from one generation to another, right? Dehumanizing public transit makes cars and that independence more valuable. What's the value of a car when you didn't grow up like me in a family? Like, if we made more money, we could move to another neighborhood and get a better house. What's it like to grow up in a community where redlining and housing discrimination really inhibit real estate as an investment? That's what I wasn't taking into account. Those sorts of hidden structures. And those hidden structures are all around us. Generational wealth, cultural norms, what's seen as acceptable, who has the right to interrupt whom, right? Infrastructure, sometimes really inaccessible. You just discourse patterns, who talks, who's allowed to talk, who sees themselves as having space in a room to talk, and the stress and burden of minoritized status, right? So we know a lot about the stereotype threat is an added burden on minoritized individuals. These structures often work against equity, and they're often hidden to many of us. We can do a better job of noticing, paying attention, and working against these structures. So just to recap, I want to go back through my own story, and this time go forward in time, right? And I want to highlight the fact that at the very beginning, this is where I just had enormous advantages. I grew up in a household with math toys all around me. We were talking math all the time. By the time I got to school, I could do a lot of the math that my peers were just about to start once they got to school. And that's became because my parents were highly educated. They were both college math teachers. And right here in grade school in the gifted and talented program, this is where I want to really focus on how this culture of mathematics helped me, but not others. You see, the teachers, my peers, they all took my previous opportunities as a sign of some sort of innate talent that I had. That's the sort of myth of brilliance. The fact that I was male, I was a little boy, a little white Asian boy, I was cisgender, able-bodied, like I was seen as belonging in the sort of nascent field of mathematics for young kids. I sort of fit the part like a purebred dog at a dog show, right? And others didn't. The system that I was in, this gifted and talented program, that was a system that was perfectly set up exactly for people like me. And others, including way too many girls, Black students, Latinx students in the particular area I was growing up, some immigrants from Southeast Asia, those experiencing poverty, those those students who had equal potential, they were not seen as brilliant. They hadn't had the opportunities that would have gotten them seen as brilliant. They weren't seen as belonging within this field of like kids who do really well at math. They were not in a system that was built for them. If you look closely at every stage, right, the myth of brilliance helped me, but it didn't help others. My identity worked in my favor, but it wouldn't have worked in others' favor. And these systems were tailor-made for me, but not others. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible for people to succeed. I'm just saying that it's much harder. And in fact, recently we've seen lots and lots of stories of people from various groups who have succeeded. And you can go read about them in Living Proof. You can go check out these web pages, Mathematically Gifted in Black, Lathisms, Indigenous Mathematicians. There's a great series of videos on Meet a Mathematician. They've done a great job of highlighting mathematicians of color. But if you look carefully through all these, we know it's harder because we talk about the barriers they have overcome, right? And if we look at any of these stories, you should start asking yourself, like, where exactly did this myth of brilliance that we have within the mathematics community, did it help them or did it hinder them? This idea of math as pure, did it help or hinder them? These structures that we're talking about, whether it's in the mathematics community or in academia more generally, or in society, did those structures help or hinder people? And instead of and I think we do need to hear these stories. These stories are great, but we also need to acknowledge in every one of these stories includes those barriers that people encountered. Let's take a look at those barriers and let's figure out which of those barriers we can lower and how we can lower them. So when it comes to DEI issues, I think there's lots of reasons to hope. And I do want to talk about the ways in which people are doing great work and the ways in which I think we are in mathematics, like really positioned well to take on these issues. When it comes to the hidden structures, hidden structures, this is like our bread and butter. Like we have a whole field of mathematics called category theory, which is just about sort of seeing these hidden structures. Like, but let's apply that sort of thinking to the structures around us that impact DEI issues. When it comes to developmental mathematics, we know we can do better. We can do better than the 11% of students getting through co-requisite supports and making sure that students are in courses that are aligned with their goals, like statistics and quantitative literacy, depending on what their major interests are. We know that you can get from 11% to things like 70%. That's some of the work that the Dana Center really concentrates hard on. High stakes tests, like we know that there are replacements for high stake tests. Grading for growth is one of those. Grading with projects and portfolios. There are things that we can do that are much more equitable when it comes to assessment. And when it comes to advising and placement, using multiple measures, or something my friend Eric Sue at San Francisco State is just working on, guided self-placement. We think that those can be much more equitable, and help close some of these gaps. These are some of the and all of these hidden structures, like this is who we are, right? Saying hidden structures, we can do better, and then we can solve those problems, because that's also part of who we are. We are master problem solvers. We also know what works, and to understand what works, I want to take you back to SUNY Potsdam in the 1980s. Back at SUNY Potsdam in the 80s, they had 20% of their college students who were getting degrees were getting math majors, and that's an astonishing number. Right. And that was all, in fact, if you look at the numbers of math majors way back then, the school generating the most math majors back in the mid 80s was UCLA, with something over 200 math majors. The second school in that list was SUNY Potsdam, right? It's like a tenth of the size, but somehow that's second in that list. And the person who was responsible for a lot of this was a man named Clarence Stevens. A lot of those students, including a lot of Black students, were getting math majors. Clarence Stevens was the 9th African American with a PhD in mathematics. His degree was from Michigan. And what I really would love to do is sort of time travel back to the 80s, and visit SUNY Potsdam to figure out what they were doing. The next best thing is to find a memo that was written by a guy named Rick Lutman. He was a professor in California, and he went out to visit Potsdam for 3 days back in the 80s. And he wrote this memo. And every year at Project Next, I run a session where we dive into this memo. This memo is just really full of just great nuggets about how to run a department, how to run a program in a more equitable way. The intro says much of what distinguishes the program at Potsdam is not what the department does so much as the way it thinks. It's a matter of attitude. And these are the points that are fundamentals of the Potsdam model. Very first, there you see it. It's about hard work, not innate talent, right? So from the very get-go, you see that these are echoing some of these ideas I've put out today. Keeping up morale is part of the job if you're in the department at Potsdam. Abandoning lecture, we know this. We know this from a lot of data, that not only is abandoning lectures in favor of more active learning techniques, we know that's better for all students. It's better for understanding, but we also know that it's better, especially for students who are less likely to see themselves as belonging. And so, active abandoning lecture, right? We know this all from the math ed literature from the last 30 years, but they knew it back in Potsdam. Like, they knew that it worked. Pare down the curriculum to like the core ideas, right? And teach math for the joy of it. This last idea, this no criticism zone, it's one of the most important things that we implemented when I was at St. Mary's College of Maryland. This idea that at no point would we criticize in any public space students at all. Like, we no ragging on students in any public space, right? This idea of a no criticism zone, it's something that I love talking about, and I talk about with Nexters every year. All of these ideas, like, this is like the collective knowledge of a program where they honed these and they worked, and these were fantastic ideas, right? We know these work. Let's get these sorts of ideas into our math departments all across the country. I also think there's reason to hope because there is now more attention than ever from the inside, right? So people in positions of power are paying attention, right? And we see a lot of great examples of this. The AMS report last summer from the task force on the history of racial injustice within the AMS, just a fantastic report. It starts with the tragic story of William Claytor. If you haven't read this, you should go read that. CBMS has a recent statement that was unanimously passed last December on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. You can go find that on their website. And AAAS, their program Sea Change, is for all STEM fields, but they are really working hard on trying to make sure, especially the structures within schools, are more equitable. All of these from really big, important organizations suggest to me that there's more attention than ever on the inside. Right, it's this idea that I think I first heard Elizabeth Warren say, like, we get change when there's attention from the inside as well as pressure from the outside. I think we have attention on the inside. We also have lots and lots of programs that work. Great programs led by a lot of great people, some of whom we're going to hear from in the panel after this, especially a lot of young folks, people of color, trans folks. One of them is EDGE. It's been going on for a couple of decades now. It's especially looking at women going down to graduate school in mathematics. EDGE for Women is their website. Paradigms is a more recent program that their website is on the AMS's website. They've done great work, especially with directors of graduate studies at research institutions. And RFAM too, I love the fact that this is a very grassroots effort led by undergrads and trying to make sure that other undergraduates who are in mathematics, especially those from minoritized groups, have what they need in order to succeed. And I'll plug one more that's coming up. You know, we did math chairs for racial justice a couple summers ago. This coming summer, Eris Winger and Courtney Gibbons are leading Math Leaders for Racial Justice. This is with National Science Foundation money, and we're going to get math leaders again together to talk about issues of racial justice within math departments. And so encourage you to go sign up, or encourage your chair to go sign up and join those conversations. So there are a lot of programs that work, and that we need to sort of amplify these programs that are working. But I think, these programs are great, but I think there's sort of a core hard part that I hinted at earlier, that those of us who are in this room, have succeeded, have really benefited from these ideas, this myth of brilliance, this idea of purity. Even if we have overcome some of these issues more than I certainly have, you still have benefited from them in other ways. I love this quote: consciously we teach what we know, unconsciously we teach who we are. Some of these benefits, some of these aspects of the mathematics community we have internalized. They've become part of who we are. And are we willing collectively and individually to change who we are? That, I think, is a core question. In terms of willing to change, I remember this moment when I was in therapy a few years ago. When I talked to my therapist, people keep talking about doing the work, but I don't really think I understand what that means, right? And so I want to unpack for maybe you're like that like I was then. What does doing the work look like, right? So I think here are some ways that we can all do the work. We can reject this framing of innate talent. We can stop talking about brilliance. We can acknowledge that, nobody here is saying that there are no differences, right? If you raise two kids, you know that there are some innate differences, but those differences, they are dwarfed by the differences in opportunities, right? So let's start talking about those, and let's start framing everything in terms of work and opportunities. Let's and focus on opportunities instead for everyone. Let's reject these views of purity, pure math, right? Let's stop talking about pure math versus applied, right? It's all math. We're better off if we do that. We can create ways of getting honest feedback. We heard this great talk. Mike Hill was talking about UCLA and how they have quarterly town halls that are really open and supportive, and we're not judging students when they bring us complaints. These are ways to get really good feedback on issues that are coming up in your departments, right? And then you can start to act on them. Let's start seeing these invisible systems and working to change them. This is some of the work that predates me at the Dana Center, but the Dana Center has done a fantastic job of looking at these systems and figuring out ways of making them more equitable, right? And that's some of that work, the sort of working and talking with each other to figure out, to see these systems that are otherwise invisible. That's the work that we're going to do with the Math Leaders for Racial Justice coming up next summer. Let's shift from supporting math research to supporting people who do math research, right? And I think this difference, it's a little bit subtle, but I think it's important. You know, if you think, and I guess everybody on this call agrees, that mathematics ability is distributed sort of the same across, independent of race, gender, other identities, if you believe that, then you have to admit that we're missing out on fantastic mathematics by those who are kept out of mathematics. And if you want better mathematics, you need to start supporting those. If you as a person or an organization want to support math research, you have to start supporting people, especially those who are historically left out. We have to lean into difficult conversations, and that can be really hard. And we have to switch to change, especially for academics. I feel like I was just trained to listen, to respond. We have to learn how to listen, to understand, and then to act to change what's going on, right? These are things that we have to do. That's the work. We have to work to make sure that everyone can flourish, in the words of Francis, to make sure everyone can flourish in the mathematical sciences community, to make sure that we can rehumanize mathematics. You know, back in the day, back in the 90s, it was coming out week, and I went with my friend Mark McLean, who's a mathematician at Seattle University. We were both in graduate school. And coming out week, they brought Dan Savage to campus. And so we went to this Dan Savage lecture. And at the end, it was a long Q&A session. And Dan Savage was asked, like, what can allies do? What can straight people who, support gay and lesbian, bisexual, trans folks, what can they do? And Dan said something that really stuck with me. He said, I used to have a long answer to this, but now it's really short. Stop oppressing us. And what he meant was, stop voting for people who oppress us. Stop tolerating policies, cultural norms, interactions that oppress us. Stop doing all of those things. And so that's my closing thought for you. You want to help make the math community more equitable? You want to address these issues for Black people, for Latinx folks, for women, for LGBTQ folks? Stop oppressing them. Let's stop oppressing them. And that's with our words, with issues like brilliant and things that connote innate ability. That's with our attitudes, like talking about our subject as if it's pure. And that's with all of the structures that we have, right? So many math classes that are just used as weed out classes. And those weeding out classes weed out, disproportionately weed out students of color and women. No student, no single person here, no one person has the power to make these changes, but together we can make the math community a more equitable place. Thanks. Please, Carrie, rescue me from this long silence.
So I just want to say thank you so much to Dave. Because we're in this webinar format, we can't really do like the little hand clappy thing or the hooray. So I'll just have to clap for you. And try to channel some of the energy that's coming from the chat, which is all fabulous, great talk, thank you. So yeah. So I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions. I would encourage folks to put all of the questions for the talk and for the panel, which comes next, into the Q&A. I'll spend a couple of questions with Dave, and then we'll go into opening questions for the entire panel. So Dave, your first question goes back to the list of lessons that you shared from Potsdam. So how do you really deal with that content pressure, especially when you feel like you're getting pressure from maybe multiple places or particular departments that need XYZ? How do you really trim that out?
Yeah, a lot of these problems are what's termed in other places wicked problems. Like, these problems are wicked in the sense that, like, it's hard to even wrap your head around all of the parts of this problem. Like, we are part of these big systems. It's hard to figure out where to start. And there's when you're faced with a wicked problem, there's a sense of helplessness. Like I just control this one little piece of this big system. Like the engineering, they demand that we teach all these parts of the calculus curriculum, right? And so these are hard problems, but we can attack these through systemic change, right? So we can attack these by having conversations with engineers. And if you talk to the folks doing engineering education, like, they no longer want a lot of these topics, right? And so it may be that your engineering department says, yes, we need some of these very computational parts of calculus, but the folks doing education research in engineering, they disagree, right? What they want is a lot more focus on core concepts, right? We can focus on in some sense. The mathematics community we have not acknowledged the fact that we in our teaching, we have not acknowledged the fact that computers exist. And it turns out that they do in fact exist, and we should be leveraging them, right? And that should change what we talk, it should change what we teach, it should change how we teach it. And it's hard because those same sort of inertia that affects other departments as well, right? But when it comes to the mathematics that we teach, we should be much more focused on concepts, on core concepts, and on the idea that if we give students the sort of core ideas, then if they need a particular computation, right, if they need to solve a particular form of differential equation or a system later on, like, they will have the tools to understand the ideas, and they'll be able to do that, right? And that's hard, right? But we need to start having those conversations with client disciplines, as well as start reforming our own courses.
Thanks, David. Really resonates with me also as an applied person who lives in other departments and has done a lot of work with that Summit Few project. So your next question, and maybe this is the last before we get into the panel, so I'm going to throw a doozy from the audience here. With the current discourse in today's society getting louder and meaner, what can we do?
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I think math is getting pulled in, like we saw recently in Virginia. On the Virginia, there have been 100 people working really diligently to make sure that high school students in Virginia were getting the mathematics that they needed, to sort of in line with their aspirations. It was called the Virginia Math Pathways Initiative. On the very first day of the new governor's term, he canned the program, right? And we see increasingly that mathematics is getting pulled into a culture war. And we need to figure out ways of avoiding that, because the math wars of a couple of decades ago were not good for anybody. Most importantly, they were not good for students. And so I think we need to center our students and start thinking, like, what's really most important for them. When I hear a lot of these arguments in the math wars, I think this idea that we're protective of systems that helped us. I think that really, I think about that a lot when I look at people sort of defending the status quo. But I think I don't think it's both sides. I don't think there's just two sides of this, but I think lots of people have to start opening, and listening to understand. And there are lots of issues. Like, I think we do need to make sure that students who show a lot of promise have opportunities to explore and aren't sitting in courses where they're just bored stiff. And there's lots of ways to do that. And some of those ways involve, teaching those classes in ways that sort of have problems with a low floor and a high ceiling, so students can get into those problems. But it also involves maybe getting students to, accelerate into courses that are a little bit where they need to be at that moment. And we need to acknowledge that and figure out systems that work for those students. Anybody who's sort of defending the current system has to deal with the fact that, that we sort of think in a lot of places that calculus is like a prerequisite for, for doing STEM college. So you have to take calculus in high school. Anybody who wants to defend that has to deal with the fact that as of 2013, if you look at high schools in the US, public high schools in the US, the percentage of public high schools that actually taught calculus was less than half. It was 48%. And if you look at high schools where, where they're primarily serving Black and brown students, where at least 75% of their students were African American or Hispanic, it drops to 33%, right? And so it's like the pathway to calculus needs to be reformed, and at the same time, we need to make sure there are other pathways that are available to students, right? And this is absolutely vital, and we have to figure out ways of talking about this with each other that center the students and not ourselves. When we center ourselves, we protect all of these things. We protect our myth of brilliance. We protect the systems that got us where we are. And when we center our students, then we can actually start making progress.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks so much again. So, on that note, I'm going to, and because it's 12:59, I'm sure by the time I'm done talking, it'll be exactly 1 o'clock Eastern time. So I am going to transition us over to the panel. So for those who are unfamiliar with the format of this lecture series, what happens is after our invited lecture, we have an open panel where the speaker can choose to really go into depth on one of these issues. And so as Dave already sort of set us up to talk about what are the programs that are making a difference in the community and raising those voices a little more, I'm proud to introduce briefly our panelists that are joining us for that discussion. So we have 3 panelists in addition to Dave. Lee Trent is a senior undergraduate math major at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology and is one of the founders and organizers of the online undergraduate resource fair for the advancement and alliance of marginalized mathematicians. RFAM2 is sort of the acronym. I botched that, I think, but it's just RFAM is I think how people say it. Kaitlin Tademy is a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and has participated in EDGE as both a participant and a mentor. And finally, Bianca Viray from University of Washington is a co-organizer of Paradigms and Roots of Unity. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have a couple of questions just to help introduce these panelists to the broader audience, and then we will open it up for broader community Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A. So the first question I have for all of the panelists, and I think I will start with the order I did introductions, just so you can be on the ready. So Dave just named some of the programs that are doing great work, programs you're all involved in. Can you tell us a little bit about each of these programs? What's your role? How do you think about that program as addressing issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice? So Lee, go for it.
Hi, so I will tell you a little bit about RFAM. It's a conference, it's online. It started during the pandemic when everything was online, but it will always be online because we want it to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And it is for undergrads, especially those from any marginalized group. We use that term very broadly to mean students of color, queer students, women, also disabled students, non-traditional students, students at community colleges, anyone who might need extra help getting involved in the community because they're maybe a little bit outside of the core of the mathematical community. I hope that makes sense. So those are the students that we're trying to serve. And we have 3 main things going on in the conference. We have crash courses to introduce students to fields of math that they might be interested in, that they might not have heard of. Our stories to provide some representation for them to see some early career mathematicians who share some of their experiences and can talk about what their time as an undergraduate was like and how it got them where they are. And some panels to talk about various summer and semester programs that students might apply to, like REUs and internships and study abroad programs. So, yep, that's what we do. We've done it twice now. We're going to keep doing it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your work. The same question, a little bit about programs that you're involved with, Kaitlin, and with respect to EDGE.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about EDGE on the side of being a participant of the program and also being a mentor in the program. So I want to describe like what the EDGE summer program really look like. So it's a 4-week program that usually runs in the month of June with 14 participants women and non-binary grad students who are either about to start their first year of their PhD or have just finished their first year of their PhD. And so you spend those 4 weeks doing what, I don't know if I want to call them a crash course, maybe like accelerated courses in algebra, analysis, measure theory, and machine learning, and also a mini course in MATLAB. And all these courses come with ample homework assignments that, everything's happening very quickly, lots of information, lots of homework, but problem sessions also held by the EDGE mentors who are grad students who were not necessarily EDGE participants. So you don't have to have done EDGE to be a mentor if you're thinking about that, by the way. Yeah, and so they have these 4 accelerated courses and this mini course and these problem sets, and also the notes to type up. So they're doing lots of work in a short period of time. And sure, there's the goal of like, let's have some exposure to these like graduate level courses, but also the goal of we're doing this incredibly complicated work in a short period of time. How does that make you think about like, how am I going to cope with this when I start my PhD program or once I come back to it? How do I know like what my resources are? What am I going to do in a situation where I feel like I have too much work in a small amount of time? Who can I turn to? What are my values? What does success look like to me? And how can I achieve that? And that's all happening while we're doing these other community building things along with the problem sessions, like these weekly outings or colloquia. And so I think of EDGE as, wow, it feels like a lot longer than 4 weeks, but it's like this sort of mathematical getaway where you're doing lots of hard work, but you're also doing a lot of community building and networking so that once you leave the program, you have this support system. And I really just described what the EDGE summer program is, but I always have like this quote in my head from when I did EDGE as a participant where someone said, y'all think EDGE is great now, just wait until after, because that's when EDGE really starts. And so, yeah, it really is more than just the program after that. I mean, there are EDGers in all stages of their careers, in all different careers in math, or even who started math and have left, who can be there with you for like every step of whatever journey you're in, if that's applying for jobs or like applying for grad schools, or maybe you're leaving math, maybe you start in academia, you're going into industry. So it really is this like huge, awesome community where, you know all of these people who can be there for every part of whatever your journey is. So I think that's really awesome. Shout out to Women Math Warriors.
Sounds amazing, Kaitlin. So next, I just want to put the question to Bianca.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. So I'm here to speak a little bit about Paradigms. So first and foremost, I should say that Paradigms was the brainchild of Justin Lanier and Marissa Loving, and I was very honored and privileged to be asked by them to come on and try to make their vision a reality. So they envisioned an impressive slate of programming that's really targeted at graduate program leaders. So the idea is to help graduate program leaders build a supportive environment to then support students and expose the hidden structures, work on all of the things that Dave mentioned in his talk. So we have 3 types of programming. We have big conferences that are for the entire math community, for anybody to come to. And then we have small working groups where graduate program leaders, so we use that to mean graduate program chairs or anybody who's on the graduate program committee, or maybe people are on the diversity committee and they're thinking about their graduate program. So in their department, you can join working groups and we match you with other people at different departments across the country who are at similar profile departments, just to build a community of practice and to sort of share knowledge and help brainstorm suggestions and see what's going on. And then we also supplement these with workshops. which happen throughout the year. And those again are targeted at graduate program leaders, sort of focusing on like specific concrete tips. So we had one, for instance, on holistic graduate admissions. And next week we have one talking about qualifying exams and GREs and how those fit into graduate programs and what it does when you like require the GRE. Yeah, so it's some commonalities to the program that Dave was talking about Leaders for Racial Justice to bring faculty members together, but it is really targeted at sort of a graduate program and trying to bring professional development and learn about best practices from like social sciences research and bring that directly to grad program leaders.
Great.
And I want to highlight the just great work being done by on all of these groups. In addition to the sort of myth of brilliance that I talked about, there's, especially in the US culture, there's this myth of sort of change happening by like lone people who are working by themselves. And Bianca, I love the fact that you like quickly bring in all the rest of the folks who started Paradigms. And that's true of every one of these programs, right? These are programs that were started by groups of people, and it's a little bit unfortunate that we're reinforcing that by just having one person from each one of these groups up here, but it's sort of a necessity of the format.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's so important to point out because it's, I'm a big believer in community creates change. And so, Dave, I know you already talked about chairs for racial justice, but is there anything else you wanted to mention there? A plug for tomorrow?
No, I think just like what Bianca was saying, part of these systemic issues, right, are really hard to see, and we have to acknowledge that, right? And so once you acknowledge that, then you're like, okay, well then how do you start to see them? And that's where I think these conversations can be really helpful. So if you get people into small conversations in places where they trust each other, right? They're willing to be vulnerable and they're willing to talk about some of the issues that come up in their own departments. That's what we're going for in Math Leaders for Racial Justice. And it sounds like that's what the Paradigms is really focused on. So I encourage folks out there to to go seek out all of these programs and make sure that the people who think you would really benefit from these programs know about them, and make sure that and that goes on all levels, right? So Lee talking about undergrads who could use better better knowledge of what's out there. Kaitlin talking especially about women heading to graduate school, and Bianca talking about graduate programs.
Yeah, I love that we have all sort of stages of career folks on the panel as well. So I think that's the beauty part of this community, not just who we're addressing, but who's here as leaders in the community. So I think that's wonderful. So I just want to shift slightly and just talk a little bit about some of the other points in terms of those problematic pieces that you mentioned, myth of brilliance, the love of purity, the hidden systems that keep us from really doing the change work that we could do. And so I was wondering if folks wanted to share some reflections on ways that maybe one or more of those themes resonated with you. And I'm going to rotate again through the panelists in a slightly different order, but I'm going to start with Kaitlin first.
Yeah, so there were two actually that kind of like worked together, I think, in my own experience and during my first year of grad school, thinking about the purity issue and the hidden structures issue. I started to realize that there were certain ways that there were certain struggles that seem to be widely accepted by the math community, while other struggles are seen as like deficiencies, where people say things like, well, maybe math isn't for everyone, maybe grad school isn't for everyone. And you kind of start to wonder like, okay, well, who is math for? Who is grad school for? What exactly do you mean by that? So my first year of grad school, I did not make any formal progress. I didn't pass any of my classes. I didn't pass any quals. I didn't pass any like in-course exams. I mean, I took an incomplete in one of my courses and had to finish it over the winter. I was making very, very slow progress, if any, and needed to redo that whole first year during my second year. And in that process of, realizing that like I'm doing everything at a very, very slower pace than everyone, feeling like, do I belong here? Is this a problem? Is math for me? Is grad school for me? Type thing. I had to get really, really familiar with the structures of like, how do I meet these requirements in my department? And then in the process, becoming very critical of those structures and like the ways that we're expected to complete these, these milestones. And I started to realize that things like, for example, the qualifying exam, when I first started studying for it, it was like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to refresh myself on all these things that I learned in my first year sequences or whatever. But by the end of it, I just wanted to pass them so that I could hurry up and move on to the thing that I felt like I was ready to do. It started to become a barrier where really I was just doing it so I could get the like extra money on my paycheck and stop having to have this specific stressor in the summer or in the winter. And so I started to realize that there are a lot of requirements that we have in our programs that I feel are sold to us as these are steps that you need to take in this order in order to be successful. However, they start to show up as barriers depending on the person that you are. And I think that definitely the traditional assessment is one of those biggest things. So that's where I saw that show up in my own experience.
Thanks, Kaitlin. I remember asking somebody once about, I think it was the advisor for the qual, and I said, and I happened to ask the question like, oh, so like it's just a lot of proofs to remember to all of the different possible theorems, and they were like, no. You gotta, what you're learning here are the techniques, and you just need to illustrate that you know some of the standard techniques. And I was like, what? I just like, for some reason, I had never heard that before. And like, why did I not hear that until like my second prelim? I don't like, that just makes no sense. So anyway, so yeah, super resonating. Bianca? I'm sorry, the prompt was about, some way in which these are resonating, these themes are resonating.
Yeah, so I think for me, the one that resonated the most, like in my personal story, I mean, of course, all of them have resonated in what I've seen in mathematics, but in my personal story is this idea of purity and like really like the myth that math is completely separate from everything else. And I think Dave mentioned this idea that we want to move towards supporting the people doing mathematics. And I think like, well, one, I really agree with that. And I agree with that just because like, that speaks to me as a human. Like I want other humans to be supported and like not stressed out, alleviate, suffering or problems when I can. And also I have found for me that like supporting the person or me feeling supported has really affected directly my ability to do mathematics, and not only in opportunities, but just like actually like in that moment, the math my brain is capable of doing, it makes a big difference if I feel supported or not. And so one of the biggest, I think, illustrations of this is just like a couple months before I was graduating, finishing my PhD, I found a mistake in my thesis. It's sort of like all like unraveled, like this thread that just pulled everything together. And looking back now, I can see that I was mathematically capable of fixing the problem, but in the moment, I did not at all feel capable of fixing the problem. I mean, I would try to work on it and fix it, and I would make like a tiny sign error or something, and I would just like collapse like, how can I do this? You know, this must mean I can't do math. I'm never going to be able to fix this. People are going to find out like I'm a fraud. And so I ended up being able to fix it by working with collaborators. And I think for a long time, I sort of bought into the idea that like, oh no, I'm doing all this work with collaborators and that shows that like I can't do math on my own. And I'm just like riding on my collaborators' coattails. And well, like, I think to honestly assess that, you have to ask my collaborators. But I will just say from my perspective, I feel like I'm like more ambitious and more creative and more excited about doing math when I'm doing it in the moment with people that I like want to do better math for my friends. Like I want us to create amazing math together. And for me, that's like a much more true motivation than the idea of like, whenever this project is finished, like 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line, I share it with the broader community. That's too hard for me in the moment. So yeah, and it really helps me see, I saw from the Potsdam like tips, like it's really about sharing the joy of mathematics. And I like to be able to do that in every step. And it makes me do better math when that joy is really ever present.
Bianca, I love that answer, and this I want to tie it into a question that was asked in the chat a bit ago, like about people who think of math as apolitical, sort of outside the politics. I think these go hand in hand, like thinking of mathematics as sort of pure, or being able to support the mathematics somehow, as opposed to supporting the people. Like you can think of mathematics as apolitical if you think of the mathematics by itself in some sort of platonic way. But in reality, it's people who are doing that mathematics, and you have to support the people. And when you're supporting the people, it does get messy, right? People are part of political systems. People are part of societies. People are subject to all of these other forces. And so that fiction that a lot of people tell themselves, and then frankly, I used to tell myself, like that sort of mathematics was able to live outside of these systems. It is a fiction, and we have to call it out as a fiction.
So I guess it's probably my turn.
Yeah, I was going to formally say, Lee, yeah, go for it.
So I think that in my experience, probably the thing that has made it the hardest for me to get where I want to be is a lot of hidden structures. Because we have this idea that like, you want to grow up and be a mathematician, you go to undergrad for 4 years, you go to grad school for, I don't know, how long is that supposed to take? 5-ish? I don't know. But you're supposed to do them one after another with nothing in between. And with no breaks. And I had to take a year and a half off of undergrad because I was really sick. And I was no longer eligible for a lot of math things. I was not eligible for student membership with some math organizations because I couldn't provide proof that I was enrolled full-time. It's not eligible for RAUs, so you have to be enrolled. And I mean, a lot of our like programs are designed for, this is for undergrads, this is for grad students, this is for professors, and there are a whole lot of people who are professional mathematicians or student mathematicians who don't fall neatly into those categories, and then they are not eligible for those things and they're being left out. And I think that you probably don't have to think about it too hard for it to be clear that it is more likely for people of color and queer folks and women to be in those spaces in between those neatly defined categories, because they maybe a queer student has housing trouble with their family, and so they have to take time off because they have to get a job so they can live by themselves, or things like that. So I think that like eligibility requirements like that, and just the way that we define categories makes things hard.
And thanks for sharing that notion of these like buckets that completely cover the space or even independent of each other. Yeah, thanks, Lee. So just last call for folks to put questions for the panel, or community call for questions in the Q&A. But I have another one for y'all, which is like kind of thinking about other places. I know Lee just talked about eligibility requirements really specifically, thinking about changing those. Are there other places where you feel like the community really needs to do some work, or whether hard or low hanging, etc.? Go for it, Lee.
I think that something really important is to think about mentoring students in a more complete way. It's like, you have a student, they want to be a mathematician. What do you give the student for them to build a mathematician out of themselves? Or, well, they already are, but to build whatever kind of career that they want for themselves. And like, it's more than just teaching. You have to do more than just teach math. Like, mentoring needs to involve professional connections and networking and helping someone understand themselves to be a mathematician. And so, and marginalized students especially are the ones who are not getting identified by potential mentors for more complete mentoring. So I think it's really important to have more complete mentoring, because just teaching people math isn't all that they need.
And if others want to respond, you can sort of just unmute. We don't really have hand raising in the traditional sense, but other places where we could do some work, or where there's calls.
Yeah, I think that I also think a lot about the ways that we mentor students. And I think that another part of that is acknowledging the power that we have. I guess this isn't specific to mentoring, but acknowledging that we have a lot of power, especially those of us who are teaching, and recognizing that the things that we do and say to people are not just impacting math. I don't know what that means, the field, but like the people within math. And those things that we do and say really do have lasting impacts, especially when you're mentoring students. I think that a lot of us have like very impactful, whether it's positive or negative, stories about these little, very specific interactions that we have with people, where the person on the other side of it probably won't even be able to recall it, because they didn't realize the power that they were holding in that moment. So just recognizing that we really do have power and that we need to use it intentionally to empower others, I think would strongly change the situation that we're in.
Okay, so when I thought about this question, I didn't think so much of like actual things, maybe because my list of things we could do is too long, but more just going along with some of the things Dave talked about, some things that are maybe unique to mathematics that have helped. And so one thing for me, I feel like math is unique among other fields, that it has such a long history, and that the foundations, like, they haven't changed, right? We like proved our foundational results about like rings and groups and continuity, and like they're correct. So we haven't changed them. So I think that makes us especially bad at like rethinking things and articulating why we do things and whether it's still necessary for us to do them. Like, we have had, as a field, like content field, we've had to adapt less than other fields. And at least for me, that has helped sometimes. I think sometimes we jump to a question of like, oh, what should we do instead? Or is anything wrong with this? And for me, it's often been helpful to first ask, okay, why should we do this? Let me try to think about like, is there something we're trying to do? And then going from that helps me more directly, envision how it should be different. and hopefully not create more hidden structures. I mean, I don't always do a good job, but this step at least helps.
I really appreciate the three of you joining us in this panel. And Carrie, I really appreciate you. You know, you do a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure the HGTM session goes off without a hitch. So I want to thank you for monitoring all of the different channels that we have going, and for hanging on to us as we go through this this panel. So thank you for that. And
yeah,
Susie,
thanks to you. Thanks to the whole panel, also for me, Suzanne, who introduced you, everyone. Team effort, right? That's what this is about.
thanks everyone.